Oh, okay. I'll get off of this then. Joe, if you definitely want to do this. Whenever you're ready to go, Joe. All right. Okay. Hello, everyone. I think it's the 19th of December, and welcome to Dis and Dat.
Uh,
Joe?
Sorry, I didn't know you went live.
Oh, yeah. Hello, everyone. Dis and Dat. We're going to look at Cambridge Capital today. Uh, it's originally called the Cambridge Capital Controversy. Uh, it may, in fact, be, sort of anachronistic or even to discuss it now is kind of chaotic, but perhaps we need to return to some of the roots of the problem. But some people will say that it's been superseded. Um, Triple C, as some might refer to it, has also a variety of other elements in it, but it begins to define the and sort of not necessary to be read. I think people have sort of set it aside, but the reality is that it identifies in the 1960s some of the initial issues of the difference between neoclassical economics and or orthodox and heterodox economics approaches. The heterodox, of course, being defined by some folks as post-Keynesian, et cetera. And I was going to scroll down to a quote by Steve Keen, which I'm having trouble finding, as you can sort of see. Um, I'll give a definition of the controversy itself. I have a little thing where um, Yanis Varoufakis sort of takes Piketty to task, um, sort of accusing him of just simply capitulating to neoclassicism and for a variety of reasons. And all of those things are useful in the big picture of trying to construct a research program. Anyway, Steve Keen says, of course, the average, darn it, here we go. The average economist would never tell you that economic theory has suffered such a devastating blow. This is because the average young economist doesn't even know that this intellectual bout took place. The concepts in this debate don't make it onto the curriculum for either undergraduate or postgraduate students. Older economists cannot avoid some knowledge of the war, but they erroneously believe that their camp won, or they dismiss the issue completely. And I agree with Steve on that matter. On the other hand, every once in a while, we have new articles on this thing, and that revisiting it is important for new knowledge, but also to resist a kind of retconning the uh, that is that there's a kind of problematic or retroactive continuity that sort of sits in the history of economics. But in most fields, that's the kind of issue that people sort of forget or rediscover that, oh, well, in the 60s, a bunch of intellectuals decided to go look at Marx again, for example, and all of those stories that sound like war stories or unnecessary things that are part of our we should be more concerned about, intersectional kind of debates or, language problems, correctness, et cetera, or, the rise of fascism. Anyway, to complete the quote on by Steve Keen, today economic theory continues to use exactly the same concepts which Piero Sraffa's critique showed to be completely invalid. And there is no better sign of the intellectual bankruptcy of economics than this. Steve, of course, has his a very different view of the problems of economics, but it's useful to consider that we still have a varied set of views, and it's important to come back to this partially, well, for my own interests, and you'll see this in a moment. The Cambridge Capital controversy goes back to the 1960s, and let's see, there's a new article, Passanetti. All right. The Cambridge Capital controversy, sometimes called the Capital controversy or the two Cambridges debate, was a dispute between proponents of two differing theoretical and mathematical positions in economics. It started in the 1950s and lasted well into the 1960s. The debate concerned the nature and role of capital goods and a critique of the neoclassical vision of aggregate production and distribution. The name arises from the location of the principles involved in the controversy. The debate was largely between economists such as Joan Robinson and Piero Sraffa at the University of Cambridge in England, and economists such as Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So that's where the two Cambridges. The English side is most often labeled post-Keynesian, while some call it neo-Ricardian, and the Massachusetts side neoclassical. Most of the debate is mathematical, while some major elements can be explained as part of the aggregation problem. The critique of neoclassical capital theory might be summed up as saying that the theory suffers from the fallacy of composition, specifically that we cannot extend microeconomic concepts to production by society as a whole. The resolution of the debate, particularly how broad its implications are, has not been agreed upon by economists. In classical orthodox economic theory, economic growth is assumed to be exogenously given. That is, growth is dependent on exogenous variables such as population growth, technological improvement, and growth in natural resources. Classical theory claims that an increase in either of the factors of production, for example, labor or capital, while holding the other constant and assuming no technological change, will increase output, but at a diminishing rate that will eventually approach zero. That's classical theory in a nutshell. The so-called natural rate of economic growth is defined as the sum of the growth of labor force and the growth of labor productivity. The concept of the natural rate of growth first appeared in Roy Harrod's 1939 article, where it is defined as the maximum rate of growth allowed by the increase of population, the accumulation of capital, technological improvement, and the work-leisure preference schedule, supposing that there's always full employment in some sense. Now, if the actual economic growth rate falls below the natural rate, quote unquote, then the unemployment rate will rise. If it rises above it, the unemployment rate will fall. Consequently, the natural rate of growth must be the rate of growth that keeps the rate of unemployment constant. You can see that that's how artificial it already is. If the natural rate of growth is not exogenously given, but is endogenous to demand or to the actual rate of growth, this has two implications. At the theoretical level, there are implications for the efficiency and speed of the adjustment process between the warranted and the natural rates of growth in Harrod's growth model. Also, there are implications for the way the growth process should be viewed and for understanding why growth rates differ between countries, whether growth is viewed as supply determined or whether growth is determined as demand determined, or determined by constraints on demand before supply constraints begin to operate. Now, God, well, this last paragraph will get a little hairy. It's probably already hairy for you now. Let's sum this up with the central issue. This is Wikipedia. The question of whether the natural growth rate is exogenous or endogenous to demand, and whether it is input growth that causes output growth, or vice versa, lies at the heart of the debate between neoclassical economists and Keynesian slash post-Keynesian economists. The latter group, that is the post-Keynesians, argue that growth is primarily demand-driven because growth in the labor force, as well as labor productivity, both respond to the pressure of demand, both domestic and foreign. Their view does not mean, post-Keynesian state, that demand growth determines supply growth without limit. Rather, they claim that there is not one full employment growth path, and that in many countries, demand constraints, that is, related to excessive inflation and balance of payments difficulties, tend to arise long before supply constraints are ever reached. That was the point I was making yesterday and days before that the current sort of state of the world, inflationary issues intervene because it's not identical globally. As much as people want to claim that it might be, it's not. It's really a more regional phenomenon. And the balance of payments issues, that is, I mentioned this yesterday, I was talking about currency. You try these things, this is part of the bigger value discourse, that so much is going on and things transform in problematic temporal ways, spatial ways, that it's really hard to get a handle on some of these things. I mean, we can make certain generalizable claims, but they're not always good. So there's a moderately new article on the survival of a flawed theory of capital, mainstream economics, and the Cambridge capital controversies, which has now returned us back to that conversation by Francesco Nunes Pera and Mario Gracia Mora. Let me read you the abstract, which sort of is what piques my interest. The Cambridge controversies on capital theory opposed heterodox economists, mainly from the University of Cambridge, UK, to mainstream economists, mostly based at MIT in Cambridge, USA. The controversy started in the 50s, occupied the pages of some of the most influential journals. Their primary outcome was the broad acknowledgement of flaws, which we retrieve, Pereira and Mora retrieve in the concept of aggregate capital. Despite that acknowledgement, aggregate homogeneous capital remains a staple of contemporary macroeconomics, as if the Cambridge controversies never existed. To account for this apparent paradox is the aim of this article. We examine the arguments seeking to justify the enduring commitment to the aggregate capital approach and argue that they indicate an implicit commitment to instrumentalism. The indifference to the results of the Cambridge controversies is a consequence of methodological conformism and has shaky foundations. Now, the point here is that, a significant amount of the assumptions about how the economy operates are being made with, sort of not so much faulty logic, so much as that it's sort of a defaulting to a kind of, it's easier to assume certain things than try to actually account for everything. And as I've mentioned way, way back, that, it's quite possible to account for more stuff now. That's what supercomputers are for. So that I think that we can leave certain homogeneous assumptions. Now, one of the most contentious issues within this controversy is the reversal problem, which deals with the seemingly paradoxical finding that the same set of production functions, and, without getting too deep in the weeds on this, production functions allow us to get a sense, get a handle on on optimizing certain relationships between capital and labor. And it's sort of the basis of how you teach stuff, is that, you need to just say that the math works better because you've made certain kinds of assumptions. And once you start veering away from that, assuming that, well, humans are involved, it gets a little nuts. Uh, let me see. Let me not get too far down into the technical thing. It is uh, one of the things that they teach in, that can be taught in basic courses is the concept of elasticity or inelasticity and the issues of substitution. Um, and if you can make Department One, for example, into a kind of um, more regular, let's put it that way. If you could make it a more consistent, if you can simplify it to a certain point, it makes your math work better. That's kind of what Marx was trying to do, in Capital, is to try and get the math to sort of explicate one of the certain basic issues about how economic growth operates, to see that it has production relations. It's really very conventional, and to see that what was happening when you blew it up into a real economy. You moved from when certain conditions changed, and that capital became more important than labor. What Marx identifies is no different in a classical situation. The point is that neoclassical economics took on certain assumptions and decided that, well, because the math works, we can continue using it. And you can see that certain other issues identified by people like Keynes say, well, you made all these assumptions, but the real world sort of doesn't quite operate that way. There are flaws or imperfections that that are kind of important and create crisis. Now you can see that the issue of crisis, because of Marx, is really actually very important to see. Well, maybe, from Marx's point of view, I mean, there are two views on this, of course. We can improve, we can reform the economy, or we can revolt, or we can turn over the whole damn thing. It's more than that, of course. What we're talking about is problems in transformation and distribution ultimately, which is why people like Piketty have become important. There's all this inequality. There's stuff going on. It just becomes more complicated. So, and Burmeister's conclusion is macroeconomics textbooks discuss capital as if it were a well-defined concept, which it's not, except in a very special one capital good world, or under unrealistically restrictive conditions. The problems of heterogeneous capital goods have also been ignored in the rational expectations revolution in virtually all econometric work. Yes, rational expectations is the greater kind of exposition of macroeconomic assumptions. In other words, this is doing it at much higher levels of math, and it not only works, but it just works easier if you assume certain things operate a certain way, and that humans operate a certain way. And as we know, and that's where the kind of behavioral revolution occurred, or the behavioral turn in economics went, that often you can't account for those things. But that's we can ignore it because we can put it in certain experimental frames. That is, it's okay to assume that that we could theoretically model behaviors among consumers, for example, in such a way. So that's part of the deal. Among other things. So that, sorry. So in going back to my original point was, there's a little commentary. This is actually a Henry George School thing. And Varoufakis critiques Piketty's idea of capital, a very popular idea, popularized idea, to talk about that divergence of inequality, wealth, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and that redistribution of this divergence continues, and whether it can be fixed or not is an interesting problem. And Piketty's solutions are more about rethinking the concept of intergenerational inheritable wealth, blah blah blah, and how is it that we can redistribute these things? Can we create a wealth fund that does this, or taxation, or whatever? There's a whole variety of potential policy solutions, but in fact, they still come to some the necessity of radical conclusions. And the point for some people is that the Cambridge controversy, talking about this difference between neoclassical and heterodox, or orthodox and heterodox, however you want to frame it, not a tempest in a teapot. The questions have not been resolved. It's only buried. The fundamental issues are still there, the ones that Steve Keen, among many others, MMT brings up. Modern money theory does exactly the same thing, is to reframe some of these issues because they were sort of underattended to. We could say that Marx on Money is symptomatic of that, and note that MMT goes further than that and is more about the policy debates, which is actually really important and are quite post-Keynesian in the sense that, it's what is it you're going to do in terms of designing an optimal welfare function for the economy, et cetera. So the thing that I've been fiddling around with, to get onto my little fiddling around, is to reframe some of the core concepts involved in the Cambridge controversy, such as capital production and value. And for me, it's just to understand it a little bit better. I had a little research project to figure out, Straussian stuff relative to not single commodity, but joint production ideas, which what Passanetti, who I included a video with Passanetti, and with respect, Passanetti is fairly old in this particular video. It was done 8 years ago, and Passanetti, has is being asked in this thing without preparation, what happened in the 1960s, as if anyone could remember. And so probably you can skip the first 10 minutes of the video, and he finally gets down to what he was doing. Essentially, what he was doing was assembling, the fundamentals of the Cambridge controversy, that is getting all of the parties sort of to get all their articles put together and to frame them in a way that becomes important. Note, of course, that it gets lost in the usual kind of flurry of what academic work is, and then its translation to the real world doesn't quite occur, or occurs in little strange fits and starts. Now, I decided, as usual, to have Gemini simplify some of my outlining, and it's not so much outlining for research, but posing the problem, which I think is what Gemini is useful for, is to see what the large language model is operating from. And as I've noted in earlier commentary, there are implicit biases in how it operates. If you mention Marx, then it just shifts to a different data set. And then you get this weird thing cranking out that altered the original presumption of your question to Gemini. So that's not going to get fixed for a while, I think. It's unfortunate, and that's an aside, and we can talk about that at some other moment. So what I sort of asked it was whether you could spatialize the Cambridge capital controversy, and it came up with this: that is, the heterogeneity of capital. That is, there is a spatial specificity of capital. Economic geography emphasizes that capital is not homogeneous. Needless to say, you sort of can see already which side of Cambridge capital controversy economic geography would be, but varies across regions due to technological differences, infrastructure, labor skills, and institutional frameworks. This heterogeneity challenges the neoclassical assumptions of a uniform capital stock. That's the core of the controversy. Capital as a bundle of heterogeneous assets. By focusing on the physical and intangible components of capital, economic geography can contribute to a more nuanced understanding of its composition and how it differs across space. This is the David Harvey point of view. Capital and regional development. Spatial distribution of capital. Economic geography explains how capital is distributed across regions and its impact on regional development patterns. This perspective highlights the uneven accumulation of capital and its role in creating regional disparities. Capital and regional growth. By analyzing the relationship between capital accumulation and economic growth at the regional level, economic geography can contribute to a more comprehensive understanding of the capital output relationship. Embodied technical change and spatial dynamics. Note, of course, that the technical change is part of, the switching argument and a variety of other things. Capital and technological change. Economic geography explores how technological change is embodied in capital goods and how this affects their mobility and spatial distribution. This perspective challenges the neoclassical assumption of disembodied technological progress. Spatial diffusion of technology. By examining the spatial diffusion of new technologies, economic geography can contribute to understanding how capital accumulation and technological change interact to shape regional development patterns. This is, Gemini doing it sort of a grand tour kind of description stuff. Institutions and capital. Institutional context of capital accumulation. Economic geography emphasizes the role of institutions such as property rights, financial systems, and governance in shaping capital accumulation and allocation. This perspective highlights the importance of institutional factors in the capital controversy. And then finally, spatial variations in institutions. By analyzing how institutions vary across regions, economic geography can contribute to understanding the differential impact of capital accumulation on different places. So, this was just my question to Gemini to sort of give a perspective on kind of my own research stuff. And so, as usual with this and that, I include other things that might be useful. This is, of people still alive talking about stuff. Pierangelo Shergiani did a thing that's in the Wayback Machine. It's sort of the internet never forgets, and so it's still there. It's some set of notes that was done for a econometrics conference on capital and the neoclassical theory, and these are musings on the one hand, but Giorgiani was sort of there from the beginning, at least to the beginning of the argument of the Cambridge Capital controversy sort of discourse. So this front end idea is sort of there. It sort of goes a long way to this will describe some things that may seem opaque to you, but they'll ultimately come together in this little brief conclusion of his paper from 2009. If we start thinking in those wider terms, we must first set aside Marshall's interpretation of Ricardo and the classical economists as representing an early simplified version of later demanded supply theory. Demanded supply in Ricardo and the early classics had never been determinants of normal prices, rather than merely movers, so to speak, of actual or market prices. That's, Adam Smith, towards a natural price or price of production determined independently of them by forces governing the division of the product between wages and profit, alien to any principle of factor substitution, and therefore to the ultimate source of the neoclassical problem of capital. Once that clarification is accomplished, we may find there the alternative that we're looking for, free from the difficulties of capital. It is a theory well tested in its long tradition. Its contemporary revival, initiated by Piero Sraffa in 1960, has involved with a reconstruction of its analytical structure by means also of comparison with neoclassicism, the development of the theory with respect, for example, to the basic question of the stability of its normal position. That's what Steve Keen was sort of yammering about. It has also involved dealing with special problems like the treatment of joint production, fixed capital, or land rents, right? That things I yammer about a little bit. But it has, above all, regarded work intended to include the Keynesian analysis of aggregate demand for both the short run and, most importantly, the long run. When the vision of the forces governing the economy underlying that classical analysis will be grasped, it will be found, I believe, to be surprisingly close to that, inspiring much present theorizing, aiming to bring out the basic role of institutions in the economy. So ultimately, we get all the way to, sort of the discourse begun by people like Veblen, et cetera, and brought on by Williamson to talk about the institutional elements. Classical analysis may then perhaps allow to develop and refine that work, providing it with a solid analytical framework free from the straitjacket of a generalized principle of factor substitution undermined by the results of the capital controversy, and even independently of that, hollowed out by the reformulations which that controversy has brought about in neoclassical theory. So ultimately, the divide is still there. People are trying to fix it. There are a bunch of clerks running around doing math and trying to get it to either work better or some small fragment to try and work better. And the big assumptions are far too complicated for some folks. And it's better to, build your methodology, ground up and all that sort of jazz. And so all of those things are there. Now, of course, talk about the bigger picture is, super complicated and beyond kind of where we're trying to go. But I did want to make some final comments on this that are important. And the point, of course, is that to try and get to certain kind of Marxist positions. And without getting too far in the weeds here, there is the issues that ultimately the neoclassical school or orthodox economics engages in is something that, you could say, well, it's all just moral suasion stuff. I mean, that's the thing that is, exogenous that we can't or shouldn't have to deal with. We just sort of have to do the math and get it to work through. Which, if you go back to Marx, that's kind of what he was trying to do, is trying to get, I did some of the math and, the things that we wanted to do in pamphlet form have this analytic kind of structure, and you can sort of see that it's working. People get stuff, exploitation occurs, expropriation occurs in some form or manner, and what we want to do is identify the instruments under which that sort of happens. But even that alone is a kind of sort of moral assumption that that's the dismal science side of economics, that people would not like to sort of integrate too far into the process, particularly at the production level. Now, of course, we know that Marx went on in subsequent volumes of Capital to talk about, well, it's not all production. It's about, distribution. It's about circulation. And key to that, of course, is this idea that you don't have one capital, but you have multiple capitals sort of, circulating and interrelating. And yes, it is much more complicated to think about, but the fact is it better models the world. And while you can do, sort of toy models that sort of work out it at one singular level, you need to see, and in fact, to control for it, or at least to analyze it in a way that allows you to say, okay, well, this fundamental problem is never going to be solved, which is kind of this, you could say that there's sort of a Sraffian paradox there. Maybe we can never solve this. what is its importance, or why are we talking about this still, is to see that you need to have that as the sort of front end of the argument. If nothing else, to sort of use it not in a straw way, but to say, okay, well, there is this assumption. It assumes a kind of perfect world, and there's all these other folks, Joan Robinson, et cetera, who say, well, it's not quite perfect. It's never going to be perfect, and we sort of have to think about that. Just phrasing it, the argument in that way raises a kind of moral question, which is kind of the whole reason to do more heterodox approaches, whether it's post-Keynesian or whatever. So the point here is, some members of the Marxian school argued that even if the means of production earned a return based on their marginal product, that does not imply that their owners, that is the capitalists, created the marginal product and should be rewarded. And see, that's a fundamental issue, is, do they deserve the filthy lucre? And I would like to say that in the recent election, you could say that that exact thing has happened. I don't think that all these people who are looting the economy, et cetera, deserve what they get. And the fact that people are going to attempt to loot it further, that is, there's a new cap constraint on Medicare and a bunch of other things that are going. I didn't expect my life to be sort of legally stolen by capitalists just so they could get a better, more Lamborghinis or something. In the Sraffian view, the rate of profit is not a price, and it is not clear that it is determined in a market. In particular, it only partially reflects the scarcity of the means of production relative to their demand. While the prices of different types of means of production are prices, the rate of profit can be seen in Marxian terms as reflecting the social and economic power that owning the means of production gives this minority to exploit the majority of workers and to receive profit. But not all followers of Sraffa interpret his theory of production and capital in this Marxian way, nor do all Marxists embrace the Sraffian model. In fact, such authors as Michael Leibowitz and Frank Roosevelt are highly critical of Sraffian interpretations, except as a narrow technical critique of the neoclassical view, which is what I was just saying. There are also Marxian economists like Michael Albert and Robert Hanel, who consider the Sraffian theory of prices, wages, and profit to be superior to Marx's own theory. So anyway, I've yammered far enough and probably lost a whole bunch of folks in this particular approach. I'm getting close to the end of my time as usual, but this sort of defines the kind of the difference between the two Cambridges, and of course it's just the similarity of names that, of course, sort of probes this debate, because it's not America versus England or whatever. It's just simply that this, breaking of a particular point and between major figures in the field is actually somewhat interesting and important. And as we've said before, it is, most of the debate is mathematical. It is a, fallacy of composition, a logical problem, and the question of whether you can extend microeconomic concepts to production by society as a whole is still being worked through. And I think you can see this in the move from, for example, applications in the analytic approach to Marxism from basic game theory to more evolutionary game theory, and to suggest that by simply, moving towards a much greater or much more enhanced concept of certain other ideas that exist in parallel in other fields, you could say, in fact, that this debate between the Cambridges is an example of a kind of punctuated equilibrium in thought, in the production of thought, and that's kind of another way in which you could sort of talk about that. So I read through the basic theoretical elements. I've identified that there are several approaches to this, some of which have come up recently. I've mentioned Steve Keen. I could close with Varoufakis, which I may or may not do, but I have exceeded my time, so I'm gonna stop now, ask if there are any questions, comments, or brickbats. Seeing none, I will ask to cut the live stream. Joe, if you can cut the live stream, we'll stop